Today, we're going to dig a little deeper than the daily headlines on the war in Ukraine. We're going to explore a really fascinating analysis that tries to reframe the entire conflict, tracing its roots way, way back through history.
So, let me just start by asking you a question. When do you think this war really began? For a lot of us, the obvious answer is 2022. Others might say, no, it was 2014. But the source material we're diving into today argues that to really understand what's happening, you have to look much, much further back.
In fact, the whole argument is that what we're seeing today is just the latest phase of a long-running imperial continuity project. I know, that's a mouthful. So let's break down what that actually means.
All right, first things first. What exactly is this idea of an imperial continuity project?
Okay, so here's the core idea. The argument is that this isn't really about one leader or one specific government. It's about a persistent, centuries-long effort that has continued through different Russian regimes, Tsarist, Soviet, and now post-Soviet. And the goal, it argues, has always been the same, to erase what makes Ukraine distinct and, ultimately, to subordinate it to Russia.
Now, you might be wondering, okay, but what's the evidence for that? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The analysis does a side-by-side comparison of the language and justifications used back in the Soviet era with the rhetoric we hear from the Kremlin today. It's all about finding the echoes, the patterns.
And that brings us to the first major theme that this analysis pulls out, this idea of manufacturing a threat in order to justify your actions.
And this slide just lays it out so clearly. Look at this. On the left, from the Soviet era, you have the state going after a so-called nationalist-fascist organization. And on the right, in our time, the justification for invasion is the need to fight neo-Nazis. The labels are a little different, but the function, it's basically identical. You create an enemy to give yourself permission to use force.
This isn't just theory, either. This quote comes from a 1962 text about Soviet crimes in Ukraine, and it shows the playbook in action. A mythical organization is invented. An enemy is named, and suddenly you have an official reason to carry out massive purges against anyone you don't like.
So here's the key takeaway. These labels, they're more than just propaganda. The source material calls them a permission structure. It's a clever way of reframing things. You take Ukrainian national identity, you reclassify it as a dangerous fascist threat, and in doing so, you basically remove the moral guardrails against using extreme violence. It's not repression anymore. Suddenly, it's self-defense.
Okay, so you've manufactured a threat. The next step, according to this analysis, is to launch a direct assault on Ukrainian identity itself. And that brings us to our second big theme, the war on identity.
I mean, you can't get much more direct than this quote from the Soviet newspaper Pravda in 1938. This isn't just about encouraging people to learn a new language. This is a declaration. It's establishing a cultural hierarchy. It's a policy of Russification.
Now, let's jump forward more than 80 years. Here, Vladimir Putin is arguing that an independent Ukraine is an unnatural anti-Russia project. The analysis connects these two quotes, decades apart, to show the same underlying belief, that Ukraine defining itself outside of a Russian context is simply unacceptable.
And this is exactly why the analysis calls it an identity war. It's a battle that's fought in classrooms with history books, over monuments. It's a fight over the fundamental things that give a people their own sense of self. And it's a pattern that, sadly, we see being repeated in occupied territories today. This war on identity flows right into our third theme, which is how Ukrainian sovereignty itself gets framed as a kind of betrayal, something illegitimate. And again, the historical parallel is just uncanny. Back in the Soviet Union, any push for more autonomy in Ukraine could be shut down by labeling it an anti-Soviet conspiracy. Today, Ukraine's desire to join, say, NATO or the EU is framed as an aggressive anti-Russia project. The logic is exactly the same. Your independence is seen as an act of hostility towards me.
This quote from the speech that launched the full-scale invasion in 2022 just puts it all out there. Ukraine choosing its own path isn't just presented as a political disagreement. It's framed as an existential threat to the very future of Russia.
So, the source argues this is a classic imperial mindset. The center gets to define what's normal and what's acceptable. Any real move towards independence by the periphery is seen as dangerous, as a challenge to the entire order that must be crushed. And this isn't just an abstract idea. This logic has had brutal, real-world consequences. Just look at this number. 9,439. That number comes from one of the historical sources. It represents the number of bodies that were exhumed from mass graves in the Ukrainian city of Vinnytsia, victims of the Soviet purges in 1937 and 38.
These weren't soldiers. They were mostly ordinary people, peasants, factory workers, local officials, executed by the secret police and dumped in unmarked pits. And in a final, unbelievably cynical move, one of those mass grave sites was later paved over to create a public park.
So, all of this deep, dark history, this pattern of imperial control, it's absolutely crucial for understanding why we are where we are today.
So, the bottom line of this whole analysis is this. What we're watching isn't just a fight over territory or borders. It's the violent peak of a very old imperial project designed to control the identity, the culture, and the future of an entire nation.
I think this slide just sums it up perfectly. You have two different eras, but the underlying imperial logic is exactly the same. The language might get updated from a nationalist-fascist threat that justifies purges to a neo-Nazi threat that justifies invasion, but the playbook is chillingly consistent.
And that takes us right back to the question we asked at the very beginning. According to this analysis, this war didn't really start in 2022 or even in 2014. Those were just the latest, most violent escalations. The real origin point is a deep-seated, long-standing imperial refusal to ever fully accept Ukraine's right to exist as its own country on its own terms.
And so, we'll leave you with the question that this analysis ultimately poses. Beyond all the geopolitics and the strategy, what does it really mean when one power tries to deny an entire people the basic right to define who they are? Thanks for joining us.